Mayor Robert Blaze to submit a proposal for the visitor center that was just months away. And we had hoped with John Weitzel, who's an animator, Peter and myself, to create a kind of a hands-on type of thing for kids. And that's what you see with this image here. There's a 1960 built, 1960 sunk yellow submarine in Lake George. So we're going to have a facsimile of that and then have 2-minute voyages for these kids. It never came about, but wow, what a wonderful slide. So I thought this would be perfect as an intro to my talk. Now, I'm going to do things a little differently here. I'm going to talk about what came before the Lake George vessels. And I mean, way before, and trace it through several thousand years on up to the French and Indian War and the American Revolution. And then I'm going to talk about changes in naval design in the 16th through 18th centuries. We're going to talk a little bit about the shipwrights who were here, although Russ Bellico is really the expert in that. And then I'm going to look at the warships of the French and Indian War and how some of those were at Lake George during the American Revolution. Well, all of these watercraft that you see zigzagging back and forth, and it's only going to get heavier traffic out there as we're getting into the real summer. Are they boats or are they ships? And the expert, the Royal Museums at Greenwich, UK, and their definition is this: if a vessel is below 40 tons of cargo carrying capacity, and a ton would be, this would be one side of a ton, all right, roughly 4.5 feet by 4.5 feet by 4.5 feet. And it comes from the French, and a ton had 2,000 pounds and 252 gallons of wine. That would be about what, when I was at college, we would drink during a dorm party. You know, Boone's Farm, apple wine, and so forth. I didn't realize, the historian in me, I had to go back and find out that that came on the market in 1961, and it was a Gallo product. So if it's under 40 feet, under 40 tons carrying capacity, then it's a boat. A ship is greater. However, all fishing vessels are boats, even if they're 200 feet long. They're a boat. All submarines are boat. U-boat. Okay. Now, on this illustration that I have here, it shows a bateau being hauled by a wagon along a military road and so forth. And it got me thinking. There's something called nesting. And these larger warships in the 18th century, they would also carry smaller, launches and so forth. And they would stack them, maybe 2 high or 3 high, and that's called nesting. And as I was looking at this and wondering why there wasn't an early standardization of size and shape of bateaus, it got me thinking that when I get up in the morning, open up a cabinet in the kitchen to have my cereal, I hope that the bowls aren't going to fall out because they're all the same. But if you place the longer vessel and then a smaller vessel on top of that, and a smaller vessel on top of that, that's called nesting. And that's why, one of the reasons why I think when we were down there measuring the bateaus, that some were 32 feet long, some were 29 feet long, some were 36 feet long. Well, the function of warships at Lake George during this time period to conduct the amphibious operations to transport troops from the south end of the lake to the north end of the lake, 32 miles. They were there also at the north end of the lake to provide artillery power if needed to defend their armies. Furthermore, Lake George is part of the historic corridor of the Hudson River, Lake George, Lake Champlain, into the Richelieu, and into the heart of New France or Canada. And something that we sometimes forget is to support the Indigenous allies. If you go to the Mohawk Valley in 1711, Fort Hunter was built. And Fort Hunter was built by the British to protect their Iroquois friends and allies. So sometimes we tend to forget that that alliance worked both ways. Well, I've done a lot of diving in Rhode Island and Massachusetts, saltwater, oceanic, and this is what a typical 18th century vessel might look like. Even if you could see this, it might be buried under a lot of sand and so forth. Well, that's not the case in freshwater. In freshwater, the iron fasteners don't corrode it as fast. The lake has no shipworms, has zebra mussels, possibly quagga mussels one day. By the way, quagga mussels repopulate themselves 4 times faster than zebra mussels. So quagga mussels are taking over in waterways that initially had zebra mussel invasion. So there's no turtle worms to eat away at these vessels in Lake George and Lake Champlain. There's little light, so you don't get a biological growth at depth that can damage the hulls of vessels. And there are no major currents to affect the integrity of shipwrecks. Now, the ancient ships were built what is called ship-first construction. And if you look at that image there of a Viking vessel, what they would do is they would construct the hull first, overlapping its clinker construction using rivets. And then after that was done, they would take the frames and place those in there. And for the Vikings or Norse, it gave them an amazing ability to ride out rough waters in the North Sea, the North Atlantic, and so forth, because it kind of wobbled along. Several centuries into more modern times, you begin to see the curved stem at the front and curved stem in the rear vessels. You start to see a straight stern post, but there's no rudder at this time period. Rather, they're using a paddle off of one side, or for the ancient Egyptians, they were using 2, one on each side. You had these steering oars. And then the Chinese, the Han Dynasty, and the Chinese refer to themselves as the people of Han, they invented the traditional rudder. And it took a while for it to make it to the Eastern Mediterranean, to make it out of the Mediterranean and up into the northern part of Europe. And we have what's called frames first. You lay the keel, then the frames, and then you apply the planking, side planking called strakes. And as you were doing this, you had to protect that. You would build what are called castles. And there you would have your archers and later those with muskets. You see 2 sets of images here, merchant vessels versus warships. In the perfect world, back centuries ago, the merchant vessel would look like what you see in the top left-hand corner, a rectangular box. That won't go through the water very good. So they designed something that was a vessel, but it could carry cargo. And then all the way down, you can see the bottom image, looking kind of like what is called a collier. Collier is a name for a cargo-carrying vessel. On the right, you see the rogue galleys. And they were long and slim. And on the right side of that rogue galley, you had a battering ram. And then as you move centuries into the modern era, in the 1600s and 1700s, they began to rate vessels by the number of artillery they were carrying. The most were the 1st, 2nd, 3rd, 4th, 5th, and 6th. Now you see a 100-gun ship there. That's a first rate. But if you count up the portholes that you see and multiply it by 2, it doesn't tabulate to 100. That's because you had chase guns. You had chase guns in bow, we get chase guns in the stern. I'll talk a little bit about that later on. But this fellow, who actually changed his first name, dropped the L, M-A-L-C-O-L-M, to McLean. And he's the guy that came up with the concept of, rather than taking cargo off of the truck, putting it in netting, when the netting swings over and they load it into the hull of the vessel, he is the one who in 1956 came up with the container idea. And you can see the first vessel scale-wise on the left there. That was a container vessel to a big boy to the right of that. So tonnage, I mentioned about tonnage. And tonnage was for the purposes of taxation. And in Europe it came about in the late 1200s. And they had all these formulas for that. And if you're a mathematician, you could spend days giving instruction on tonnage formulas. And if you look at the image to the lower right-hand corner, that comes from a drawing from a powder horn, you can see Fort McHenry on the right. In the center is a sloop, roughly 30 to 40 tons. And to the left of that, being rowed, is a bateau, maybe 3.5 to 4.5 tons. Most of the colonial vessels, whether they be on inland waters like Lake Champlain, Hudson River, Lake Erie, and so forth, were relatively small in terms of their tonnage, maybe 20, 30, 40 tons. But even the coastal vessels were 70 tons. Now, to compare that with a very famous vessel in colonial American history is the Mayflower. And Mayflower is between 170 and 180 tons. And of course, we know the story about the Pilgrims over and so forth. It was around for 3 or 4 years after that, and there are two stories. Probably the mythical story is as the wood was beginning to weather and rot, they repurposed it into a building. Probably not, but it did see kind of an inglorious ending to its career. And Russ Bellico has written some great articles about two of the more famous sloops on Lake George in 1756 and 1757, the Earl of Loudon at 40 tons, and the George at 30 tons. Now, all these vessels are Egyptian, and they date back several thousand years ago. And then in 1954, in one of the pyramids, they discovered what is called the Khufu ship. It was 142 feet long. It wasn't built of the early papyrus. Rather, the Egyptians imported a cedar from Lebanon, and this was built out of cedar. And it didn't touch any water. It was designed for celestial transportation of the pharaoh to the heavens. Now, sometimes you'll see BC, what we grew up with. Now it's BCE, which stands for Before Common Era, and CE is Common Era, which is the same as AD. Lebanese or Phoenician warship on the left with 2 rows. This is a row galley. And then the Greeks added a 3rd row for trireme. And if you look at this replica on the right, you see something that can affect almost any wooden warship. Hogging. Hogging is where the ends go down. You can see that bulbous center there. And then begin to build what is called a hogging truss, and I'll show you an example of that. And then, like us, as we get older, we get this, as we start hogging. And that is called sagging. And sometimes you see, a ship, the profile of it, it looks like a saddle. That's sagging. Now, one of my heroes is this fellow right here, Buddy Gillespie. He was a Texan, and he went to Columbia University. 1 year after MGM was formed, he got a job working for him. And the SFX, Special Effects. He was a special effects pioneer. And he was around MGM for the 1925 version of Ben-Hur, and then he made Ben-Hur come to life. They built a huge pond, artificial pond, in Culver City for the filming of this. They had 2 1-to-1 scale rogue alleys in Rome that they filmed part of it, and then they had 9 or 10 that were 1/6 scale, and others, and even some of the crew members they had where they could walk using radio-controlled devices. It's incredible what he accomplished, but one thing, they didn't change the painting of the sky. So if you ever see that, look at the skies, and it doesn't change. Maybe the weathermen got it right way back then. Well, warships, the Egyptian galley, you can see the hawking truss there. To the Greek galleys, the Roman galleys, the Greeks and the Romans using these battering rams. By the way, one of those was found in 1980, and a gentleman from Israel did the study of that. So it would be a Hellenistic, so it's post Alexander the Great. And they found that it's made out of bronze, but no vessel. So they don't know if the vessel, it snapped off from the vessel, or the vessel just, kind of dusted away from currents and stuff like that. The Vikings with the prow with the dragon or the serpent, and at the end, that's a tail. So then you see the shields there. They didn't have those when they were going across the Atlantic. Rather, they just before they made their landing and stuff, they put them out to scare the bejesus out of who they were attacking, and apparently it worked well. But moving ahead into the medieval time period, where the vessels become sturdier. Then you get the caravel, the Portuguese take from the Eastern Mediterranean to the Iberian Peninsula, and then the galleon. And the von Homburg-Richard, since we're talking about the French Indian War into the American Revolution, that started off as a French East Indian. It was designed to carry a lot of cargo, it was heavily armed, and the French gave it to John Paul Jones for his kind of legal piracy, you might say. Well, the era of rogue galleys kind of ends in 1571, but not at Lake George or Lake Champlain. That's the Battle of Lepanto, western waters of Greece, and the Holy League, the Roman Catholics, fought the Ottoman Turks, and the Holy League had advanced weaponry, vessels, and so forth, and they won that. And you get into the age of sail. Now, Philip doesn't get the credit he should for warships, for modern era moving into colonial time periods as King Henry VIII. He took the cannon port, which came in by way of the French in 1501, and on the Mary Rose he had that, as you can see here. There is a vellum document. It's called the Anthony Roll of Henry VIII's Navy. It's magnificent illustrations and so forth. Take a look at that. But the demise of the Mary Rose came about, if you look, you can see that bottom row of guns. Well, it was too close to the water line. The Mary Rose sank in 1545. It was being dived on in the mid-19th century, and then it was refound in 1971, and very similar to the Vasa in Sweden being a national project. You had several hundred divers who volunteered to dive to prepare it for being raised in 1982. Then in 1626, they start rating warships. First rate, over 100 guns. Second rate, 98 guns. Third rate, 74 guns. Third rate also, 64 guns. Those were ships of the line. They sailed in a row, battering one another. And then you had smaller vessels that tended to be faster and so forth. But the ships of the line, 200 feet in length, 18 pounders, 20 pounders, 32-pound shot fire and greater as compared to the typical land artillery, a 6-pounder. But the ideal one was not invented by the English / British. It was by the French. And it was the 74. And the 74 carried 74 guns, obviously, 600 men on that. Swivel guns not counted, nor were initially carronades. Carronades, kind of like a short cannon. Well, the British then come along and say, well, we want to make our Navy really great. We're going to tell you how to build these. And they came up with what was called establishments, 1706, 1719, 1745, stagnation. Think of it. Car company, Subaru, they designed a car. And if they built all their cars like 2024, 2025, 2026, it wouldn't be selling many cars. This is what happened to the British Navy. These establishments ruined it, and the French surpassed the British in the 18th centuries as masters of the oceans. And then the British get a hold of a French 74. They were really impressed with this. It was the Invincible. It was fighting 5 to 6 larger rated vessels and holding its own. It had 2 rows rather than the larger 3 rows. It was sleeker. A lot of these 3-row vessels that were first and second rate, they couldn't even use the artillery on the bottom rows. So they captured this vessel, they locked it, they measured it, and then this became the premier vessel later on in the 18th century. Now, since it is pretty close to the 250th in terms of our celebration of the 4th of July, I thought I would bring in one thing to talk about related to the American Revolution. The American Revolution began, there were 3 generals that came over, sent over after Lexington and Concord, aboard the Cerberus. Who were they?
Clinton, Allen, Burgoyne.
Yes, very good. Okay. And the Cerberus was the Greek god, looked like a dog, had 3 heads and a tail of a snake. So there's kind of a little bit of irony in there. In Rhode Island in 1778, after the success at Saratoga, the French get involved and they bring in the heavy third-rate vessels, sail into Narragansett Bay, and the British, to protect Newport that they held, they began sinking vessels. And they ordered the destruction and sinking of 4 of their frigates, the Juno, the Lark, the Orpheus, and the Cerberus. I worked on all of these, but the Juno, which was in Coddington Cove and was off shore to diving, I worked with a group called the Rhode Island Marine Archaeology Project, and the founder of that was our archaeologist on the 1758 land tortoise. So this is what this shipwreck looked like after it was blown up by the British. They destroyed it. Literally, you had a web thing so you could get from one piece to the next piece to the next piece. Now, a few years after that, this vessel that you see here was built in Nova Scotia just before the bicentennial, and it was the HMS Rose, and it was renamed the Surprise. It ended up out in California, and there's a great scene in the 2003 Master and Commander, The Far Side of the World. They used that as the vessel, and it's being chased by a French vessel, and they're using their bow chase guns. But back in 1999, we had a group of school teachers in the HMS Rose, and the Navy loaned us some equipment. It was pretty cool stuff. They had a device attached to a video camera, and they would release this antenna that floated up to the surface, and they could bounce video back to the mothership here. These are these engineers with the Naval Undersea Warfare Center. I could travel on the boat. I couldn't dive off the boat, so I'd have to walk over to another boat and then get into the water. But they were a great bunch of guys. Well, the timber. The British pretty much cut everything in the 1600s and 1700s that they had in terms of timber for merchant ships and warships. They loved their oak, especially the limbs and so forth, that are great for frames. It took 100 years for an oak tree to mature so they could cut that wood for the hulls of vessels. Pine was used for masts and spars. The British did not trust live oak, which is an incredible wood. There's a narrow band that stretches from Virginia, kind of dips down into the southeastern part of the United States and over to Texas. And the USS Constitution, live oak. Now, they would cut this using something like this, a saw pit. Now, these guys are smart. They wore a white brim hat because of the sawdust, and they had boots that came up at least midway to the calf, if not more. And they would cut the wood, it would be trimmed using broad axes and adze. And the amazing thing, how to build a 74, one tree took a load of wood, so about 2,000 pounds. It took 3,700 loads to make a 74 gun. And the thickness of the hull planking was strakes 4 inches. But now on to Lake George. Bateau, below, that was our name. We were very interested in these vessels, the utilitarian watercraft of the 18th century. The word's French for boat. They were flat bottom with a slight rocker. That meant that there was about 4 inches. If you were to lay one on the floor here, you would see a gap in the bow and the stern about like this. That's known as rocker, and that allows the vessel, rather than to kind of go through and cast a lot of water inside the vessel, it made it much more hydrodynamic to a waterway like Lake George. They're typically 25 or 35 feet long. Pine boards were used for the bottom boards, for the strakes, the side planking. They used oak for the stem that's at the bow and the stern post. They were generally rowed. They had no rudder. They used a paddle or an oar off the stern for steerage. They could be rowed. Some of them in shallow water were. And they would bring a kind of a makeshift mast and sail, square sail, so they could sail with the wind. And they were built by the hundreds in Albany, Schenectady, and even along the shore of where $1 Million Beach is. And they used wooden oarlocks. And I'll show you some photos of that. The modern day oarlocks didn't come about until the 1850s, and then during the Civil War, there was a patent on one. And they had the proverbial water baler, the scoop, because they leaked notoriously. But we have something called vernacular boats. And what that means is that boat builders and shipwrights, they bring with them customs of how they learned to build. So you might say, this is what we want you to build, but they might deviate a little bit. So that's vernacular boat building. So, bateaus, first described in New York in the 1660s. You read all about it in one of Russ's books. A fellow by the name of John Gardner from the Mystic Seaport, he thought that even though we have a French name for these vessels, they were used by the French, they were used by the English, but they were used by the Dutch as well. So he thought it was of Dutch design. Howard Chappell, an eminent naval architect at the Smithsonian, he thought that there were some bateaus that could be as great as 45 feet in length. And Dr. Joe Meany, who formerly was at the New York State Museum, he said his research indicated that the smaller sized bateaus, shorter, were called Albany bateaus. They were built in Albany. And they look very similar to Peter Kahn's description. He was a Swedish-Finnish man who went through and he wrote about what he saw in his travels through North America. Yet, in Schenectady, they were building larger ones. Now, here's an example on the right of vernacular watercraft. The image that you see on the right was taken from parts of a vessel from Lake George, It's in the State Museum in their archives. And if you look on the right or the bow, it's fuller and so forth. But that's only one vessel that they had an opportunity to study. In the American Revolution, the British Admiralty standardized things, and if you look here, it's tough to see what side is the bow, what side is the stern. And that would be an example of vernacular watercraft and so forth. So it's kind of interesting when we were down there measuring all these. I don't think we ever found one or two that were the same length. War of 1812. Back 27 years ago, there was a big drought up in Plattsburgh, and on the shoreline, the War of 1812 bateau materialized. 5 planks wide, whereas the ones in Lake George were 3 or 4 planks wide. Furthermore, the cross pieces that we call battens, that typically went over where you would have, 2 boards coming together, you had a batten that would go across. They were using like 2x4s, all right? And it had the proverbial pitch pot, and these things leaked, so they would have a brush, and they would occasionally, recaulk and everything else. This, by the way, they photographed, took measurements and so forth, then the rains came and covered it back up. The big boat building area, though, if you're in Schenectady, you're heading towards Scotia, slow down the next time you're going across the bridge, because this is the big boatyard for building not only bateaus, but later what came to be known as Durham boats. They were bigger. Why were they bigger? They were sending more supplies to the western part of the colony. And for the Albany boats, they were really more for common transportation. Oh. No, it's not allowing me to. I have a video here, but it's not allowing me to advance. Okay, this is what you might find looking for a Lake George bateau boatyard. The drawings by Mark Peckham, real fine historian, works at the Hudson River Maritime Museum, is on the board there. And you can see a lot of activity, even an indigenous person building a canoe, saw pits, and so forth. You might find small versions like this in areas, and I'm sure you had something very similar to this, maybe 2 or 3 times the size down the one of our $1 million beaches. In 1758, the British decided they were going to finally leave the south end of Lake George, go to 32 miles to the north, and Russ contracted to have Gary Zavoli make this wonderful drawing as you see 2 French scouts looking to the south and seeing this vast armada of various warships coming north. And I don't know any French swear words, but I'm sure these guys are kind of perfecting it. And then Tim Cordell, a wonderful artist, his rendition of this. So they're going from left to right, so that would be from south to north. And after a disaster at Fort Ticonderoga in 1758, the British returned to the south end, beginning to build more warships and so forth. The realization comes they could not defend a boat area because the fort was destroyed in August of 1757. So what do? Just like if I don't finish what I'm eating, I open up a refrigerator, I put that half-consumed meal in there and hope it's still going to be yummy in the morning. So the lake served as a holding area over the winter of 1758 and 1759 in what we call wet storage. Sink these vessels in shallow water, like you see here with Mark Peckham's drawing. This, by the way, would be the area looking at where Weehawken Holiday House is today. They brought these things down, they used rocks to sink these, and was it random sinking or was there some type of system? Well, there are a couple of thoughts. One thought is that they sank them in clusters to be retrieved. Now, if you've ever gone swimming off of a wheel walk and you swim offshore, you kind of, 5-6 feet of water, and then all of a sudden it begins to dip down. And you have 7 vessels over there because they tried to sink it into shallow water, and guess what? They got away and they ended up in 20 to 40 feet of water. Another thought, Terry Crandall's hypothesis, he was doing work for the Adirondack Museum in 1963 and 1964. And he was doing an inventory of sunken bateaus. And he saw something like what you see on the right. And he interpreted that as being a crude buoy. And that they were sinking these things and marking them so they could come back after the British left over the winter of 1758 and 1759 and retrieve these. Well, in 1960, 2 teenage sport divers found a row of bateaux in the southeast corner of Lake George, and literally the earth shook here. And they referred to these vessels as the ghost fleet because they rematerialized after decades. 1958 law, state education law, to do archaeology on state property, the bottomlands of Lake George is state property, you have to get a permit. So, 3 entities wanted to raise these: Fort Ticonderoga, Fort William Henry, the Adirondack Museum. The guy in the center there, off on the right, we would see eye to eye. He would actually be taller than me. That is Dr. Robert Bruce Inverarity. He had this penchant for starting museum, leaving, starting museum, leaving, and so forth. He knew Eleanor Roosevelt. He headed up the WPA program in the state of Washington, and Eleanor's daughter was a reporter out there, and she would come. She wanted to support the arts, and he got to know Eleanor Roosevelt. Well, the point being is, Adirondack Museum got the permit. They raised 3 of these. They were treated with polyethylene glycol. I had polyethylene glycol this morning when I brushed my teeth. So did you. I know my wife, she uses a little makeup. She had polyethylene glycol, okay? Because polyethylene glycol is a bonding agent, and it's in missile fuel. It is one of the most used products, and here they conserve these with polyethylene glycol. You see it on the right there, the example of that. Now the thing is that they were missing frames and so forth. So one of the things that Robert Bruce Inverarity wanted, he wanted a whole vessel, even though it would be Frankenstein. You would take a board from this one, a board from this one, a board from this one, and so forth. This is what Terry Crandall saw in 1963, 1964. He was a very active member of Bateau Below. So what you see on the left there, that's almost, chronologically ground zero. He's looking at it before it's been disturbed by divers. You can see the Nutella bed on it, the frame sticking up. It was fastened, these vessels, with nails. And what happens? They rust. When they rust, what happens? Fall apart. Full pin pad. There is your oarlock. Here you see one from the State Museum with full pins. So there's the full pin pad. You would have these full pins, and when you broke one, you had a mallet, simply popped out the bottom or the top and replaced it with another. So, interchangeable parts. Gee, Eli Whitney. How about Lake George and the building of bateaus and stuff like that? Well, in 1953, Carl Dunn passed away last year. He dug with the archaeologists here. He was an early diver, didn't have a wetsuit. And Harold Peter, who was the original CEO of Fort William Henry Corporation, he built an 8-foot pram with a glass pane. You can see that in the museum. And they would go out, and Veeder would kind of bang on the side if he saw something. And there was Carl Dunn, and they were picking up artifacts to be exhibited in Fort Remember. And there's Barney Fowler looking. I'm sure a lot of us remember Barney Fowler's column in the Albany Times-Union. And God forbid if he saw a state vehicle that was out of place, he would write about that. How dare the state be, allowing taxpayers' money to be put into a fuel tank going somewhere. Well, our organization started in 1987, and we were known as the Lake George Bateau Research Team because we studied bateaus. Now, we do have Russ Bellico here, and if you know Russ, he is the perfectionist. My original dive hood came to a cone. I kind of looked like an underwater version of, what was it? Belter, Conehead, Russ bought me that one because it was made of 3 pieces rather than 2 pieces. And the top of my head didn't look like a cone. And he would carry it around in his dive bag, and when we went, he would say, "Zar, do you mind wearing this today?" Unfortunately, you can see there's a vessel that's been traumatized by divers looking for souvenirs. This is not the Weowaka site, it's another one. But the Weowaka site, you can see how it's spread out, where there seems to have been some type of rhyme or reason for sinking these. To sink them so they were in shallow water and pointed to shore for easy retrieving. Now you have an oddball there, D, and when Terry Crandall was there in 63 and 64, he said, well, I was hand fanning, I was looking for things for the museum, and so forth, and one vessel began to slide down this slope. So that is that. And the one over on the left is a 2/3 to 3/4 replica that we got permission to sink to test as experimental archaeology, how they sank these vessels, the difficulty of that, and so forth. We found out it was difficult. The one on the left here is Bateau B of Weowaka. That was vandalized in 1988. We started doing our work in 87. We had like a 2-week, gap. We came, and that's what we saw. On the right, you can see when divers would come down there, they would move these stones that were sinking stones off to one side, and they were looking for, artifacts and so forth. You see some pine trees that have fallen. If you go to the museum, you will see the likeness on the floor. You can literally walk on a replica bateau. That's Bateau C, 31 feet 7 inches long. Whaleboats are on the lake. This is not a very good rendition of a colonial whaleboat. It has metal oar locks. It has a rudder and tiller. We're really not sure if they had a rudder and tiller or if they were using a paddle or something like that. They are clinker built here rather than bateaus being Carvel. Carvel, kind of like this, right? One butt here, side by side. God gave us Carvel butts. Lucky it doesn't flip over like clinker built. Then we'd have real trouble. Shipwrights. There were several shipwrights at Lake George. Nathaniel Reserve, he built, and it was real rarity, he built a 5th-rate vessel in Portsmouth, New Hampshire during a time period when the British did not want to see vessels, warships built in colonial America. And he helped, in quotes, construct the sloop Earl of Loudon in 1756 at Lake George. He died with his son in the 1758 siege of Louisburg. Joshua Loring, major shipwright, born in the Boston area, joined the Royal Navy, real loyal to the King and Crown. He commanded a privateer in King George's War, He was captured, spent time in a Louisburg prison. He was a naval shipwright on both Lake George and Lake Champlain in the French and Indian War, and quote unquote, he helped construct the sloop Earl of Loudon in 1756, and he directed the construction of the Boscawen up in Lake Champlain. Then Russ's groundbreaking article after he found the Radeau talks about Thomas Ord, who kind of specialized in building floating gun batteries, Radeaus. And then you have another fellow by the name of Samuel Cobb. And Cobb was a shipbuilder. He was born outside of Plymouth, and he is believed to have built about 150 vessels. We know not as much about Cobb as we do of the other shipwrights who are on Lake George. James Hackett, go to Fort William Henry, walk down the hall in the West Barracks. You'll see an amazing powder horn. You actually see several powder horns, but you will see the powder horn of James Hackett. He served as Rogers Rangers in the French and Indian War. His father was a shipwright. He learned the trade from his father. He built warships, the Raleigh, the Ranger, the America, the Commerce, the Portsmouth. He was at the battles, 2 battles at Saratoga, and he worked building vessels right up to his death in 1802. It's a magnificent powder horn. It's one of the best likenesses of Fort William Henry you ever wanted to see. And the fort bought that. Was it 2 years ago it was purchased, Andrew? 2, 3 years? 4 years ago. Wow. Okay. The story goes is there was a collector of powder horns. He dies. Powder horns end up with the son. He was a university professor like his dad. He collected Thomas Edison. He was an engineer. He collected Thomas Edison memorabilia. So he had this. He saw the likeness of Fort William Henry and contacted the staff. Thus, that's how it ended up here. Well, land tours. She was around basically close to 3 days. She was launched. They tested her. She rode well. Winter was just a few weeks away in October of 1758, and they tried to sink it in shallow water. It was like trying to sink a ranch house, 7-sided floating gun battery. Got away, ended up in the middle of the lake, but it ended up in a refrigerator. There's Russ Bellickel's wonderful photograph of the bow of the Radeau. We had a team, kind of a unique team. I worked for a company called Klein Associates doing their newsletter, so I could rent this $50,000 piece of sonar for $1 a day for insurance purposes. And we had a fellow by the name of Vince Capone, who was part of Bateau Below, and Vince would go on to have an incredible career, but it started here. He raised for the Amazon CEO the Atlas rockets in 13,000 feet. He was the project manager. So John Farrell was an incredible archaeologist. Dave Van Eken provided the boat. Bob Benway was invaluable. Russ Bellicker was supposed to be there that day, but he was our historian. He had to, teach at college and so forth. But oh, okay, a kidney stone. He had a kidney stone that day. Okay. All right. Well, is that a good excuse? Yeah. And here's the sonar image, and there's a drawing that Russ dug out of the Connecticut State Archives. And when I was part of the first team that dived down, just a couple hours after we found it, I went down. I came from coal country. My relatives were from northern Pennsylvania, Binghamton area. I said, man, this is one strange coal barge, 7 sides? Well, we got some rocks in here. I wonder what they are. Oh, sinking rocks. Well, 7-sided Radeau, 26 sweep holes, 13 per side, 2 possible mast steps, hull made of oak, the upper part made of pine, maybe even repurposed pine. She was pierced for 7 cannons, 4 on one side, 3 on the other, offset for the recoil. One of the strangest things is why they cut a hole that was circular on the port side, but they made it rectangular on the starboard side. Was that because there was a mix-up in directions, or was there a purpose to that? We don't know. No rudder, rather an oar would have been used at the stern. It was flat bottom, no armament. And you can see if it wasn't for Dr. Kathy Abbas, we probably wouldn't have done such a good job. All divers male, Kathy Abbas female. Within 2 or 3 days, she earned the nickname, the Klingon Lady. And if there was a plank to be locked, a few of us, myself included, would have locked it. She was a taskmaster. There's an interesting story. Russ is going down with John Farrell. Russ's job was to photograph. John Farrell's job was to know where the photographs are. We get up there, John Farrell has a list. We have the photos, and it's different. So Kathy says, Russ, how come they're different? And Russ says, artistic license, Kathy. Well, I remember one day diving very early on, and somebody saying, well, what do you think this thing looks like? It's about 2 miles north of Fort McHenry, and I'm pointing at it saying, well, it looks like that corner bastion over there. It was a floating castle, a floating gunboat. And John Wetzel came up with a wonderful animation showing how this thing might have been built. And if you look on the starboard side here, remember we talked about sagging? You have something that's to support the sagging. And when this vessel sank, the rocks shifted to the port side. So this side, right there, that's the starboard. This is the port side. Starboard has a vertical stanchion to prevent sagging. It was blasted out by the sinking rocks. So if you look at it along the center line, you will see how on the port side, it's not as tall up off the lake bottom. Well, it opened up in August of 1994 as a New York State Submerged Heritage Preserves, and we built, for protection and so forth, a ring around the ragdoll, kind of catchy, all right? And that's what divers who in 94 and so forth would have seen. It was placed on the National Register in 1995. It became a National Historic Landmark. At the time, I believe it was only the 6th shipwreck that's an NHL because of its uniqueness of its design. Well, to kind of summarize quickly here, what are these vessels that have been on Lake George during the French and Indian War and the American Revolution? So we're going to go through and look at these. Indigenous watercraft. I saw a bark canoe back years ago. It was in a bed of Nutella, and I must have made a dozen dives afterwards to find that again, and I could not. We brought in side scan sonar. We could not find that. But they had indigenous watercraft that were bark, and I'm sure you before that were dugouts. Bateaus, as you see there, number 2. Number 3, whale boats. No whale boat from the colonial era in inland waters has been found to study. I remember talking to John Gardner at Mystic, and he said, well, if you find one, we'll take it. And I made a mistake of talking to our state historian and said, this is Phil Lord, Phil, Mystic Seaport says if they find it, they'll take it. He says, no, property of the state. 4 sloops and 5 radeaus. And the Invincible, 1759, he replaced the land tortoise. 6 row galleys, 7 rafts. The rafts were built on top of bateaus. and carried cannons. Then 8 flatboats. I don't know a lot about flatboats, but I gotta thank Andrew. You guys buy books, they look great when you see them, and then you put them on a stack with other books, and it takes years for you to get to that, to read it. Well, that was the case, and then one day I saw Andrew, and he was telling me about this flatboat and so forth. And this style of flatboat looks very similar to landing craft, to oversized bateaus and so forth, and they did have these on Lake George. Let's see, what is number 9? Gunboats, 36 feet long, and schooners. That's Royal Savage. It wasn't on Lake George, but it's pretty rich of a schooner, and Schuyler had a couple of schooners built. For rafts, you have quite a few rafts that look like this. They're off of Bolton. They have nothing whatsoever to do with the rafts that were used in the colonial era. These came from Log Bay across the Sawmill Bay, and in the process, some of these sank. Some were brought across by teams of horses, pulled on the ice. Some of these fell apart. They're down pretty deep. They're in about 100 feet of water. Here's the flatboat here, and it was adopted by the British Admiralty in 1758. It had 2 designs. One was 36 feet long by 10 feet wide, could carry 50 soldiers. The second was 30 feet long and roughly 10 feet wide. They were very similar to, the vessels that were crafted, landing craft for World War II. And Andrew Jackson Higgins. This is what was called the Higgins vessel. Look at 36 feet long, 10 feet wide. And I had the pleasure of diving on one of these in Narragansett Bay. Out of the Bateau Below project, Kathy went to Rhode Island and she started the Rhode Island Marine Archaeology Project. Our Genesis project for her, I brought in a piece of Klein equipment, Klein 595, same model that found the Red O, and we spent time, 2 days, looking off of Newport. We found 2 targets. One was an old, probably schooner that had been sunk on purpose because that's where they developed the torpedo in Newport. And the other, that's the sonar image right there. I remember going down and looking at this thing and I said, what the hell is this? We took the measurements and so forth. Then one day I was doing some research and I found out that shortly after World War II ended, there were vessels that came into Newport and they allowed the sailors to go on liberty. And they used these landing craft that they were bringing back from Europe. So 2 vessels, warships, with landing craft, one taking sailors to liberty and on shore, one returning. They collided, 2 people were killed, and I began doing research and I hunted down a 100-year-old man in Utah who sat next to his best friend, was killed in that collision and so forth. This was a LCM-3. And this is Dr. Paul Mathias. He's with RIMAP. And how we figured this thing out is that if you look at the twin rudders there, the interior is kind of wasted away. It's kind of thin metal. But the frame was, L-shaped. And I saw the video when he's moving these things back and forth, and I said, we have the measurements that we had, 50 feet and a half feet, and LCM-3s were 50 feet by 14. You had scows. You have a vessel off of town of Bolton that looks kind of similar to a scow, probably late 1800s, early 1900s, and these are used. Henry Knox used the Perry auger. The only image I could find, this was the train of artillery going from the north end of the lake to the south end of the lake. Was it like this? Remember we talked about vernacular watercrafts and things like that? But it had been pretty durable to transport all of that artillery from the north end of the lake to the south end of the lake. There's also another vessel that we call the mortar bomb bateau. It appears to be a hybrid watercraft of a bateau. So after the fall of Fort McHenry, the spoils of war, the French loaded up on vessels to take back to the north end of the lake and into their forts in the Champlain Valley. They didn't get very far off of the present-day $1 Million Beach, and one of these sank, and it was loaded with, best estimate, between 24 and 40, 160 to 175 pound, 13-inch diameter mortar bombs. So here you have one drawing done in 1962, and there seems to be a helmsman's station that's built at probably, I would assume, probably the stern, but it could be in the bow. Here you see some of the mortar bombs. The Lake George Historical Association has one. These were found, and there were a couple that were donated to the Smithsonian and so forth. Mark Peckham, he thought that they laid in an additional framework to support the weight. It only made it a few hundred yards offshore, and it went down. So you might have some type of hybrid vessel like that. Well, the last two slides to conclude. Looking at the Royal Navy, we have these statistics for the beginning of the Red War and the end of the Red War. And you can see that the British had a lot of attrition, 365 vessels at the beginning of the war, down to 270. I got a kick looking at this. The fire boats, they must have been pretty good because they started with 11 and they had one, so they were using those. And, there we go. But a lot of damage was done by the privateers in the 7 Years' War, later in the French and Indian War, during the 7 Years' War, also known as the French Indian War. Out of the colonies, there were between 400 and 500 privateers. And later on in the American Revolution, against the British, there were about 800 privateers. So even the non-traditional, formal, official Navy and Army, you get these private contractors that did considerable damage and allowed us as people to become free and independent. So that's it. And if you have any questions, I'd be glad to try to answer those. And I apologize to you expecting all French and Indian War, all French and Indian War, all French and Indian War. And I wanted to give you this sequence of watercraft as it made it into the 1700s and even into the 1800s. So, any questions at all?
I'm just wondering about the difference between, you talked about the Durham boats and the bateau, and you said Durham is a later, or maybe you just meant the name, because wouldn't they be earlier with the Dutch? How do they connect?
George Washington used Durham boats. Okay, when he crossed the Delaware, they probably had another name for him. And where that cradle was for them, we're not sure. It was in Buck County down in Pennsylvania. They were known as the Schenectady boats when they were built in Schenectady. They were longer than a bateau. There was a 10-year project back in the late 1980s, early 1990s to find one in New York State waters. That was Phil Ward who did that. Durham boats were vessels that they were really, as I said, they were up to 55 feet long. One was found several years ago in Oneida Lake. And it was studied with a professional archaeologist advising amateur volunteers. So we do have an example of that now. And so Phil Moore's long gone from being a state historian, but the seeds that he planted in terms of trying to find one really took years, but it did finally happen. So Durham boat, they came out of the bateaus, I would say. Yeah. Where the name Durham boat, who knows? Could have been an early, boat builder and so forth. You look at the World Trade Center ship, which is down in Albany now. What's kind of interesting there is that when you look at one end, it has a massive stem, and they can trace that boat building style to the cogs being built in Germany. And father shows son how to build it, that son shows his kids, and so forth. And the World Trade Center ship was built using wood outside of Philadelphia, same wood, same year, for the wood that's in the World Trade Center ship, the Independence Hall, cut from the same forest, and so forth. So, but it's amazing. It was overkill. I mean, literally overkill. So these names that pop up, they could be a local shipwright, it could be an area, and so forth. So, any other questions?
Approximately how much time would it take to build a typical bateau?
Good question. Now, bateaus could be built by carpenters. Bateaus could probably be built by fellows like myself that didn't have a lot of skills. I think what was happening is that when you had this mass production, like in Schenectady or in Albany, that they had experienced ones who were cutting the wood, looking for the frames and so on. Those frames are one piece. They would look at a tree, hardwood tree, they would say, well, I want that, I want that, I want that, and I want that. But in terms of people, sawing in a saw pit like that, it'd be a guy like me, So to answer your questions, I think it depended on how sophisticated and refined you wanted your vessel to look like. But they were mass producing these things. They leaked notoriously. But they were a craft that did what it was supposed to do. What gets me are the people who had to transport those from Fort Edward along a military road, 14, 15 miles on wagons. They must have been, looked like the Rock, each and every one of them, from lifting the Teamsters, So it all depends on, how good you want your vessel to look and so forth. So I can't say it's going to take several days, or 2 weeks, or 3 weeks, and so forth.
When I first moved to this area in the late 80s, I remember being very surprised to come across a sign on the way to Ticonderoga, no, not Whitehall, that said home of the U.S. Navy. So I assume they were referring to boats that were built for the Revolutionary War. How do they differ from the boats that you're talking about in Lake George?
Well, actually, some of the vessels, we're talking about a 32-mile long lake, and you had vessels that were built in Lake George that were taken to Lake Champlain, and vice versa in the American Revolution. Some are, very similar. Others, Lake Champlain, they built some very large, warships and so forth for the Battle of Valcourt, both the British as well as the Americans. So I would say that the vessels that were built on Lake Champlain tended to be larger, to carry more armament and so forth than what you have on Lake Champlain, or Lake George, excuse me. Yeah. So, yes, sir.
Is there an estimate of how many undiscovered bateaus might still be in the lake?
Well, so they say 260. We know of at least 40 plus. So the amazing thing is the number that they raised. I mean, it's mind-boggling how they got these things up, recaulked them, repaired them, and used them. I would imagine they have a few that are still there that have not been quote unquote discovered. Thing is, that Kleinstein scan sonar, that was the Rolls Royce of sonar. That's $50,000, back in the 1980s. You can purchase sonar today for your fishing boat for say $1,200. That's as good, if not better, in some respects. And one of the great things is, as I'm aging and so forth, is seeing a group like the Alliance taking the lead in trying to restore the mechanism that we had in place for the underwater park in the Rado and bring that back up to how it was running, back in the 1990s and so forth. Our group got old, people retired, people unfortunately died. So that was kind of a laissez-faire type of way that it was being, run. And there's still, I'm sure, great opportunities out there if you could get another archaeology team and so forth with sincere interest to try to find things and to try to do right by those. So the Alliance leading the way, working with the town of Lake George and others in trying to get the Department of Environmental Conservation to do what they're supposed to have doing. We set up a good program back then that just fell into disarray because it's out of sight, out of mind to 99% of the people. All right, so sorry to get on the bandbox again, but it just kind of ticks me off that happened. And thank God for Russ Bellico, John Denuzzo, and the Alliance, and now the Society for carrying it on.